If you were born in the 70s or early 80s, you know exactly what it felt like to wake up at 6 a.m. on a Saturday before anyone else in the house was awake. No alarm triggered that. No sound from the kitchen. Something else did it. Some internal calendar your body had been keeping all week, counting down from Monday through Friday with the same anticipation of compressed spring builds before release. The school week was 5 days of someone else deciding every variable. When you woke, where you went, what you ate, when you sat down, when you stood up. Saturday at 6 a.m. was different in a way that had no equivalent anywhere else in childhood. The house was completely still. Your parents' door was closed. The hallway was dark, and you were already moving down it before they had any awareness that morning had started. The first stop was the television, not the kitchen, because the order of operations mattered. What you found on screen at 6 a.m. wasn't cartoons. Network cartoon programming on ABC and NBC didn't begin until 8 a.m. CBS started earlier. Captain Kangaroo at 7 a.m., a live-action children's program that had been running continuously since 1955, the longest-running morning children's program in American broadcast history. But even that wasn't the cartoons. Not quite. At 6 a.m., on most channels, what was on the screen was the SMPTE color bar test pattern. 8 vertical stripes in a precise sequence: white, yellow, cyan, green, magenta, red, blue, and black, sitting silently on the tube while the station's overnight broadcast gap resolved. Sometimes it was a farm report with a man in a plaid sport coat standing in front of weather maps describing conditions in counties you'd never been to. Sometimes the national anthem played over footage of a waving flag while the station formally signed on for the day. The ceremony of it completely serious and completely unremarked upon. You sat in front of it anyway, cross-legged on the carpet in your pajamas, and waited. That waiting was its own experience. The pure, forward-leaning anticipation of sitting in a dark living room at 6 a.m. knowing exactly what was coming. Cartoons were 90 minutes away on ABC, an hour away on CBS, and the whole Saturday was stretched out in front of you like something that hadn't been unwrapped yet. You'd stayed up a little too late Friday night and woken up a little too early Saturday morning, and both of those facts felt like an advantage. The house was yours by default. You hadn't been given it. Nobody was awake to take it away. The television itself had a specific physical presence. By the early 1980s, most American living rooms had transitioned away from the wood-paneled console units of the 1970s into bare cabinet cathode ray tube sets. Zenith, Sony Trinitron, Sharp Linetron. 50 pounds minimum, sitting on a stand or directly on carpet. The Sony Trinitron used a single large aperture grille instead of the 3-gun shadow mask in competing sets, producing a brighter picture. The Zenith System 3, introduced in the mid-1980s, supported up to 112 channels and included a remote feature marketed as the Space Phone. Whatever model occupied your living room, it shared certain behaviors. The screen was curved at the edges in a way no flat panel has replicated. The cabinet radiated heat from the vents in the back, the warmth of active electronics doing real physical work. When you switched it on before the picture settled, there was a high-pitched whine from the horizontal scanning circuits, a 15 kilohertz tone sitting at the upper edge of human hearing, and the picture bloomed inward from the center as the phosphors in the tube warmed up, the image arriving from darkness the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, slowly, then all at once. The whole sequence took maybe 30 seconds. You watched it happen every Saturday with the specific attention of someone observing a ceremony. 3 channels to choose from. Maybe 4 on a good antenna day when a UHF signal was throwing itself over from the next city. You didn't scroll through a menu. You made a choice by turning a dial or pressing a physical button, and that choice required you to physically move if you changed your mind. The decision had real cost. You committed. At some point between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m., you went to the kitchen. The kitchen visit wasn't optional, and not purely about hunger, though at 7 years old you were always hungry. Cereal and cartoons were a single unit, one of those pairings that forms early enough in childhood that the two components become inseparable. Decades later, you'll find yourself wanting the other half if you encounter one alone. Saturday morning cereal wasn't the cereal you ate Monday through Friday, which was whatever your mother poured in reasonable quantities into a reasonable bowl. Saturday morning cereal was what you selected yourself, in the quantity you determined, in the largest bowl in the cabinet. Not a regular bowl, the oversized bowl that technically belonged to salad service or large communal portions at family gatherings. On Saturday morning, it came off the shelf, and it was yours, and you filled it accordingly, past the point a reasonable adult would have stopped, to the point where the structural integrity of the cereal pile became its own engineering challenge before the milk arrived. The selection wasn't casual. Captain Crunch, manufactured by Quaker, the mascot officially named Captain Horatio Magellan Crunch, his rank technically commander based on the stripe count on his uniform, a detail that meant nothing to any child who ate the cereal, stayed crispy longer than almost any competitor on the market. That was its functional advantage. The offset was that the corners of the crunch pieces cut the roof of your mouth if you ate too fast, which you did, which you always did, and then went back for more anyway. The second bowl had the roof already compromised, and it hurt less the second time. This was the Saturday morning Captain Crunch experience, unchanged across millions of American households throughout the early 1980s. Cocoa Puffs from General Mills turned the milk brown. That was the point. That was the whole point. And the milk at the bottom of the bowl when the cereal was gone was the reward for finishing. Sonny the Cuckoo Bird in the commercials would hold himself together for approximately one sentence of narration before going irreversibly cuckoo, and the joke was consistent enough that you could recite his collapse in advance of watching it. The commercial ran during the cartoon block every Saturday morning, Sonny losing it the same way every time, and the repetition wasn't a problem. The repetition was the comfort. Froot Loops from Kellogg's came in 6 colors. Every color tastes identical. The same synthetic fruit composite flavor applied to 6 different dyes, a fact that food scientists have confirmed and that any child who tried sorting them by taste discovered within their first Saturday morning of systematic experimentation. The boxes had Toucan Sam on the front, whose ability to track hidden fruit by smell drove every commercial storyline. The back panel had games, mazes, word searches, puzzles that took longer than the cereal did, which meant you were still reading the box as the bowl sat empty and the cartoon had already started on the other side of the room. Kellogg's Sugar Smacks had been renamed Honey Smacks in 1981, a rebranding designed to distance the product from its sugar content in an era when the nutrition debate about children's cereals had reached Congress. The packaging changed. The mascot, Dig-'em Frog, a frog in a baseball cap delivering the brand's enthusiasm with the full force of his entire animated personality, stayed. You probably still called it Sugar Smacks regardless. Nobody updated what they called a cereal just because the box said something new. Knowing that Sugar Smacks and Sugar Crisp were 2 different products from 2 different manufacturers, Sugar Crisp was Post cereal, its mascot Sugar Bear, a different animal entirely, was the kind of distinction that separated people who actually ate these cereals from people who were reconstructing them from memory decades later. Dig-'em Frog worked for Kellogg's. Sugar Bear worked for Post. They weren't interchangeable. Count Chocula, Frankenberry, and Boo Berry, General Mills' monster cereal line, were technically available year-round, but felt most legitimate in October, when the marketing aligned with the season and the packaging looked like something that belonged to Halloween rather than to a Tuesday morning. Fruity Pebbles had Barney Rubble attempting to steal Fred Flintstone's cereal across every commercial in an ongoing series of failures that spanned decades without resolution. Lucky Charms required strategy. The marshmallow to oat ratio in any given spoonful was a choice, and hoarding the marshmallows until the end was a system practiced by enough children that it can be considered a documented behavioral pattern. The cereal boxes were their own secondary entertainment infrastructure. Kellogg's distributed wacky wall walkers through boxes of Froot Loops, Rice Krispies, Apple Jacks, and Corn Pops in the early 1980s. Gummy, octopus-shaped toys treated with a sticky compound that allowed them to walk down smooth vertical surfaces at a pace that made a minute feel long. You collected them. You stuck them to the bathroom mirror and watched them migrate downward while you brushed your teeth. Garfield bike reflectors appeared in Kellogg's boxes. 16 collectible designs in multiple colors, red and orange and blue, intended to be clipped to bicycle spokes. Honeycomb offered digital watches in pink, blue, red, orange, and dark purple in 1980. Pac-Man cereal, launched in 1982, included Color Bubbles gum. Fruity Pebbles offered Dino eggs. Captain Crunch's Peanut Butter Crunch had spinning earth and glow-in-the-dark moon globes. The prize system gave every box a second reason to exist beyond its contents, and the ritual of pushing your arm past the elbow into the cereal to locate the prize at the bottom, before you'd eaten half the box, was so consistent across American households that it's essentially a common childhood memory rather than an individual one. At 7 a.m., CBS came alive. Captain Kangaroo opened the CBS block, a live-action show hosted by Bob Keeshan in a red jacket with enormous pockets, on the air continuously since 1955. By 1982, Captain Kangaroo had been running for 27 years, which made it older than most of the parents watching it with their children. It wasn't fast, it wasn't loud. It operated at a pace that looked slow next to what was coming at 8 a.m., but at 7 a.m. on a Saturday, it was something. And something was worth watching when the alternative was color bars. By 7:30 a.m., CBS had Tarzan and the Lone Ranger, adventure programming, animated, closer to the full cartoon experience. And at 8 a.m., CBS shifted to Speed Buggy. At 8 a.m., ABC switched on. The best of the Super Friends occupied ABC's anchor slot. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, the Wonder Twins, and Gleek the Space Monkey, drawn in the Hanna-Barbera style that had been the visual language of American Saturday morning since the late 1960s. Super Friends had been on ABC in various configurations since 1973. By 1982, the Best Of format gathered episodes from previous seasons into a curated block, which meant that on any given Saturday, you might watch an episode you'd seen before and find that it worked just as well the second time. The Wonder Twins had to physically touch fists to activate their powers. One could transform into any animal, the other into any form of water. A tactical vulnerability so obvious that it was never addressed, not in a single episode across the entire run of the series. And you noticed, and it didn't matter because they were already transforming. NBC opened its 8 a.m. slot with The Flintstone Funnies. The Flintstones had premiered in primetime in 1960, the first animated primetime series aimed at adults in American network history. And by 1982, Fred and Barney and Bedrock had been reassigned to children's Saturday mornings so thoroughly that the original primetime context felt remote, almost historical. Fred's frustration with everything moved at the same pace it always had. Barney's laugh was exactly the laugh it had always been. Dino's affection for Fred was uncomplicated and immediate, and none of that had changed since 1960, and you watched it at 8 a.m. on a Saturday in 1982, the same way you would have watched it in any other year. Because the show had achieved the permanence of something that simply existed in the world, rather than something that had been made. CBS at 8:30 a.m. ran the Sylvester and Tweety, Daffy and Speedy Show, Warner Brothers theatrical shorts from the 1940s and 1950s, repackaged for Saturday morning. Those cartoons moved at a different pace than everything else on the block. The timing was faster and stranger, aimed at two ages simultaneously, built for theatrical audiences who had paid for a feature film and were getting a bonus 7 minutes of animation. Bugs Bunny outsmarted a hunter whose motives were never examined and didn't need to be. Roadrunner operated on physics that violated every observable principle of the natural world, and the entire joke was that everyone, including Wile E. Coyote, understood this completely. The Merry Melodies and Looney Tunes shorts that made up that CBS block were decades old by the time you watched them, and they played on Saturday morning alongside new cartoons made the same year and held their own without any context or explanation. At 8:25 a.m. on ABC, Schoolhouse Rock appeared. Not during a show, between shows. Schoolhouse Rock ran as 3-minute interstitial segments at 8:25 a.m., again at 10:55 a.m., and again at 11:55 a.m., inserted into the transitions between programs, not as part of any show's runtime. The series had been running on ABC Saturday mornings since 1973, covering American history, grammar, multiplication, and civics in song. I'm Just a Bill explained the legislative process through a bill's first-person account of moving through Congress. Conjunction Junction presented grammar through a railroad metaphor. The preamble set the entire preamble to the Constitution to a melody that has proven to be among the most durable memory hooks in American educational history. People who watched ABC Saturday mornings in the 1970s and 1980s can still recite the full preamble to the Constitution because of 3 minutes of filler content that aired between cartoons at 8:25 a.m. This wasn't a pedagogical strategy they implemented consciously. It was a side effect of the repetition. The segments ran every Saturday for years, and the information installed itself whether you were paying attention or not. At 8:30 a.m. on ABC, the Pac-Man/Little Rascals/Richie Rich Show. The title reflects the network's approach to branding in 1982, which was to combine 3 unrelated properties into a single hour-long block and present them as a unified programming unit. Pac-Man was the highest-grossing arcade game in the world in 1982. Atari's home version sold 12 million cartridges that year alone, making it the best-selling Atari 2600 title in history. And Hanna-Barbera had adapted him into a cartoon character with a domestic life. In Pac-Land, the animated setting, Pac-Man had a wife named Pepper, a daughter named Baby Pac, and enemies who were the ghosts from the original game, now given individual names and personalities. The show had almost nothing to do with the arcade game beyond the color palette, the characters' basic geometry, and the fact that things got eaten. Kids who had spent quarters on the arcade version watched the cartoon at 8:30 a.m. and found it completely tolerable because Pac-Man was on the screen and it was 8:30 a.m. and the morning was still running and the bowl was still on their lap. NBC's 8:30 a.m. slot belonged to Shirt Tales, an animated series based on a line of Hallmark greeting cards featuring animals in t-shirts with messages on the shirts. The property had been designed to sell greeting cards and became a Saturday morning cartoon because the FCC's 1984 deregulation of children's advertising was coming, and the pipeline between merchandise and programming was already being built in advance of the formal regulatory change. Shirt Tales ran 1 season. You watched it at 8:30 a.m. if you were on NBC, not because it was exceptional, but because the television was on and the morning was still happening and leaving the carpet wasn't an option until the bowl was empty. At 9 a.m. on NBC, The Smurfs. Peyo's Belgian comic strip characters had been adapted by Hanna-Barbera for American television in the 1981-82 season, and the show's first year was so successful that it pushed NBC from 3rd place to 1st in Saturday morning ratings, a dominance the network sustained through the following season. The Village of Mushroom Houses, Papa Smurf in his red hat dispensing wisdom, Brainy Smurf in his glasses being correct about everything and annoying everyone, Clumsy Smurf creating problems through enthusiasm rather than malice, Grouchy Smurf rejecting each item in sequence, Hefty Smurf providing physical solutions to problems that usually could have been solved differently, Gargamel the Sorcerer and his cat Azrael pursuing the village across every episode for reasons that were stated early in the run and then simply assumed. The Smurf language, replacing nouns and verbs with the word Smurf in ways that required sentence context to decode, was more grammatically consistent than anyone designing a children's cartoon had any obligation to make it, and children parsed it without any instruction whatsoever, which says something either about the language or about the flexibility of the 7-year-old mind. CBS at 9 a.m. had the Bugs Bunny/Roadrunner show, a 90-minute block of Warner Brothers theatrical animation running until 10:30 a.m. The longest single continuous block of legacy animation in the Saturday morning lineup. A child who had been watching ABC or NBC could flip to CBS at 9 a.m. and find 90 minutes of Bugs, Daffy, Porky, Tweety, Sylvester, the Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote, Yosemite Sam, and Elmer Fudd, any of whom you already knew by sight and sound before you'd finished your first sentence of kindergarten, running until nearly the end of the cartoon window. Bugs Bunny's specific smugness when executing a plan that he knew was going to work. The Roadrunner's complete indifference to Wile E. Coyote's schemes, not contemptuous exactly, just simply operating in a different register of awareness. The cartoon could be seen 4 separate times in a single fall season and land the same way each time, because the formula was closed and self-contained and required no memory of previous episodes to work. Gilligan's Planet occupied CBS's 9:30 a.m. slot, an animated version of the Gilligan's Island cast relocated to outer space, which required either a compelling narrative justification or a willingness to simply accept the premise and proceed. The show offered the second option. Meanwhile, NBC at 9:30 a.m. ran The Gary Coleman Show, in which the former Different Strokes cast member appeared as a trainee angel helping humans with various problems. It ran 13 episodes in the 1982 to 83 season. The network moved on. Between every show, the cartoons stopped. The commercials began. Before Reagan's FCC Commissioner Mark Fowler, appointed May 18, 1981, dismantled the advertising regulations governing children's programming, Saturday morning commercial time was limited by National Association of Broadcasters guidelines to approximately 9.5 minutes per hour. Fowler's position was that the free market, not regulatory bodies, should determine advertising content and volume. He removed those limits. The effect wasn't immediate. The 1981 to 82 season still operated under the old constraints, but by 1984, the barriers were gone completely. Cultural historian Tom Engelhardt documented that between 1984 and 1985 alone, cartoons featuring licensed characters increased by roughly 300%. By the end of 1985, more than 40 animated series were running concurrently with active toy marketing campaigns. The structural logic of what followed was simple, and nobody hid it. In most cases, the toy line was developed first, and the animated program was then created to promote it. G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, first aired in 1983. Hasbro's 3.75-inch action figure line preceded the cartoon, and Hasbro maintained complete script control over the animated series in order to ensure all characters appeared on screen as much as possible, which drove up production costs and complicated staging, but guaranteed that every figure in the toy line received screen time that functioned as a direct advertisement. Masters of the Universe followed the same model. The Transformers in 1984. Thundercats and Jem and the Holograms in 1985. He-Man alone became one of the most watched animated series in television history during the Filmation/Mattel collaboration of the mid-1980s. Most of these shows ran in syndication, strip syndication, airing 5 days a week on local stations during after-school hours. But the toy commercials ran during Saturday morning network blocks because that was where the concentrated audience of children with influenceable purchase requests lived, sitting on carpets in pajamas with cereal in their laps. The toy commercial was its own genre with its own formal requirements. The G.I. Joe commercial showed 4-inch plastic action figures executing maneuvers that were physically impossible for a 4-inch plastic object, flanking movements, rapid deployment sequences, tactical retreats through environments rendered in cinematography that implied a much larger world than the actual products occupied. A voice at the end spoke at the outer edge of intelligible speed. Batteries not included. Some assembly required. Toys shown larger than actual size. You knew these phrases. You could reproduce the rhythm of them. They were the fine print of childhood advertising, present at the end of every commercial like a legal obligation spoken fast enough to fulfill the requirements without the information landing. The cereal commercials ran with equal intensity. Dig 'em Frog for Honey Smacks, Toucan Sam tracking fruit by smell, Sonny the Cuckoo Bird maintaining composure for approximately 4 seconds before his relationship with Cocoa Puffs overcame his self-control. Trix Rabbit, disguised again as something different than last week but recognizably the same rabbit, pursuing cereal from children who identified him instantly and refused regardless. The Lucky Charms marshmallow-to-oat ratio was a genuine tactical decision made every morning. You could eat the oat pieces first and save the marshmallows for the end, or distribute them evenly, or pick the marshmallows out systematically and eat the oat pieces from a diminished bowl. And every child had a system, and the system was consistent. The cartoon studios that made all of this possible operated under conditions specific to the deregulated era. Hanna-Barbera, which had been producing animated television since 1959 with the Huckleberry Hound show, dominated the landscape. Filmation contributed He-Man. Sunbow Entertainment and Marvel Productions produced G.I. Joe, in a partnership that gave Hasbro's toy division extraordinary creative leverage. Deke Entertainment, a French-American studio, handled Inspector Gadget and later Mask. The 65-episode order, standard for syndicated children's animation in the era, enough for a full year of weekday airings, meant animation was being produced at volume, distributed across multiple international studios, and the variability in quality between episodes of the same series was visible to any attentive child, though that attentiveness rarely produced complaints. The show was on. The show was continuing. That was the requirement. At 10 a.m., ABC ran the Mork and Mindy / Laverne and Shirley / Fonz Hour. 3 live-action ABC primetime properties, all currently or recently running in the Thursday night lineup, converted into a combined animated block that aired simultaneously on Saturday morning. Robin Williams voiced Mork as a cartoon alien navigating situations the primetime live-action version had already explored in a different register. The Fonz appeared in an animated format that required his leather jacket and his gesture of approval to translate into line art, which they did technically. Laverne and Shirley were relocated to the Army. The block operated on a logic that was entirely native to 1982 Saturday morning programming. If children watched the live-action versions with their parents on weeknights, why wouldn't animated versions of the same characters work at 10 a.m. Saturday? The answer, in terms of ratings, was that they did well enough to continue. The explanation for why they worked is simply that it was 10 a.m. and the cartoon window was still open and the television was still on. NBC's 10 a.m. was The Incredible Hulk and The Amazing Spider-Man, the combined block that carried NBC's Saturday morning through to 11 a.m. The Hulk's transformation sequence played out the same way every episode. Bruce Banner watching his own face change through the lens of his glasses for the 2 seconds before the glasses themselves were destroyed, the green replacing everything, the roar arriving as the walls collapsed around the transformation. Spider-Man's theme song had been written in 1967 for the original animated series and was still in use 15 years later because it had proven impossible to improve. The melody is installed in the memory of everyone who watched Saturday morning television in the 1980s with the permanence of something that was always there. Not memorized, not studied, just present, the way you don't remember learning your phone number from childhood. CBS at 10 a.m. had Pandemonium, and at 10:30 a.m., Meatballs and Spaghetti. These shows existed to fill time slots, and did so. A character had a problem. The problem was solved within the episode's runtime. Nobody was calling their shot with either of these properties, and nobody needed to, because it was 10:15 a.m. on a Saturday, and the morning was still running, and the cartoon window was still open. And if you were on CBS, you watched them, the same way you watched anything else in the block. Not because they were essential, but because the alternative was to do something other than watch Saturday morning cartoons. And that wasn't the Saturday morning decision. At 10:55 a.m. on ABC, 3 minutes of Schoolhouse Rock appeared again between the Mork and Mindy block and the beginning of Scooby-Doo. The segment aired. The grammar, or the history, or the mathematics arrived in song. The morning continued. At 11 a.m., ABC had Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo. The Scooby-Doo formula had been in operation since 1969. A talking Great Dane, a van, 4 human companions, a spooky location, a mystery, a monster that wasn't actually a monster, but a person in a costume, a trap usually conceived by Fred, usually executed imperfectly, usually involving Shaggy and Scooby stumbling into it by accident, and a mask removal accompanied by a confession about what would have been gotten away with if not for the intervention of the group. Scrappy-Doo, Scooby's small nephew, had been added to the show in 1979 after ratings softened, and he remained part of the block through the 1982-83 season. You could reconstruct every beat of the episode structure before watching it. You watched it anyway. The comfort was in the formula itself, not in the uncertainty of its outcome. You knew what was going to happen, and it happened, and the accuracy of your prediction was its own satisfaction. NBC at 11 a.m. ran Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which added Iceman and Firestar to Peter Parker's world because the network determined that solo Spider-Man lacked group dynamic. Iceman was borrowed from the X-Men comics, already a Marvel property, his inclusion requiring no additional licensing complexity. Firestar was created specifically for the show, a character invented to give the series a female member with fire-based powers to contrast with Iceman's cold. A decision made in a production meeting and formalized into a character who would later appear in Marvel Comics as a consequence of her animated existence. CBS's 11 a.m. was the Popeye and Olive comedy show. Popeye had been a theatrical cartoon character since 1933, transferred to television beginning in the 1950s, still running on Saturday morning CBS in 1982. The same character in the same physical conflict with the same antagonist across 50 years of American entertainment. At 11:30 a.m., CBS ran the new Fat Albert Show. Bill Cosby's Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids had been on Saturday morning since 1972, and by 1982, it was 10 years into its run, still delivering the same structure. A situation in the North Philadelphia neighborhood, a problem that had a moral dimension, a resolution, and a direct address segment at the end, in which Fat Albert, or one of the gang, spoke the lesson directly to the camera with a clarity that was either refreshing or blunt, depending on your relationship with that kind of structure. And if you're not careful, you might learn something before it's done. Hey, hey, hey. The moral wasn't hidden. Nothing about Saturday morning television was hidden. The commercials were commercials. The toy shows were toy shows. The educational segments were educational segments, labeled as such, and delivered at full strength. At 11:55 a.m. on ABC, Schoolhouse Rock ran its third segment of the morning, the third 3-minute insertion into the Saturday morning schedule, this one arriving in the transition between Scooby-Doo and the noon programming. The information accumulated across those 3 segments, civics, grammar, mathematics, American history, without anyone deciding to retain it. CBS at noon had Black Star, a sword and sorcery animated series about an American astronaut named John Blackstar, who crashes on an alien planet called Sagar and becomes a warrior fighting an evil tyrant called the Overlord. The show had originally aired in the 1981-82 season and was running repeats in the noon slot in 1982-83. It was one of the last Saturday morning shows to hold territory past the 12 o'clock line. After Black Star, CBS ran the CBS Saturday Film Festival at 12:30, dubbed International Films for Children, productions from European and Asian countries, children solving problems in settings that were visibly not American. Dutch farms, French villages, Japanese countryside. The dubbed voices were slightly mismatched with the lip movements in ways that children noticed and stopped noticing within the first 2 minutes. But before noon arrived, something had already changed in the neighborhood. Other children had been through the same sequence in their own living rooms, their own test patterns at 6 a.m., their own oversized cereal bowls, their own ABC or NBC or CBS from 8 to 11:30. And the Saturday morning energy that had been contained inside individual houses was now leaking out into driveways and sidewalks. A door got knocked on. You appeared from behind your own door in shoes and a jacket that had gone on over the pajamas, because the pajamas were fine. The neighborhood on a Saturday morning before noon had a specific gravity that it never had during the school week. Adults were inside. Schedules were absent. The game that emerged from the driveway was whatever game emerged from whoever showed up, organized by no one, ending when people got called in for lunch or the weather changed or the group dissolved by attrition. The geography of the neighborhood mattered precisely. Whose driveway had the longest slope? Whose sidewalk ran flat and smooth for a distance worth building speed toward? Where the pavement was worn enough to be genuinely fast and new enough to be free of the cracks and raised sections that made certain routes impractical. Louis Marks and Company introduced the Big Wheel at the 1969 New York Toy Fair and had it in stores by Christmas of that same year. The designer was Ray Lohr, who arrived at the concept by taking apart standard tricycles and reassembling them upside down, lowering the center of gravity to the point where going downhill at speed no longer produced the tipping instability that made regular tricycles dangerous at velocity. Marks manufactured the toy in Girard, Pennsylvania. Within a year of the 1969 holiday debut, it had become Marks's best-selling product in the entire company. By 1973, Marks was running print advertisements. By the late 1970s, the toy had become embedded in American neighborhood culture to the point where children who grew up without one still knew what it was from the driveways of everyone around them. The physical design of the Big Wheel made one specific thing possible. The front wheel was large, molded plastic, the distinctive aesthetic that gave the toy its name. The riding position was low to the ground, extending from Lohr's original inverted tricycle insight about center of gravity. The rear wheels were constructed from solid plastic molds rather than pneumatic tires, which meant they had no built-in traction. Smooth plastic on concrete produces minimal friction. At speed, with the handbrake applied through a turn, the rear wheels don't grip. They slide sideways across the pavement. The low center of gravity from Lohr's design keeps the machine from tipping when this happens. The result is a controlled lateral slide, the back end of the Big Wheel arcing outward while the front wheel holds its line. The sideways spin out. The move that every child who owned a big wheel discovered within approximately 48 hours of riding it for the first time, and practiced until the pavement ended. Who else had a big wheel and lived for that sideways spin-out? Mark's Toys went bankrupt in 1985. Empire Industries, which had been manufacturing big wheel variants under different product names throughout the early 1980s under the Carolina Enterprises name, formally acquired the brand. The big wheel that most children of the 1980s actually remember riding was Empire's version. Same core design, same large front wheel, same plastic rear wheels with the deliberate absence of traction. The spin-out worked exactly as it had always worked. The Green Machine occupied a separate category. Patented in 1980, it was a distinct product. 2 levers for rear wheel steering instead of handlebars, designed for aggressive cornering at the cost of the straightforward riding experience of the standard big wheel. Not a version of the big wheel, a different vehicle with a different geometry, aimed at a slightly different experience. In any given neighborhood, the distinction between the two was as meaningful as the distinction between Atari and Intellivision, or between ABC and NBC on Saturday mornings. You had a position. You owned it. The Saturday morning before noon was genuinely unscheduled time, a fact so unusual in the structured life of an American child in the early 1980s that it deserves to be stated plainly rather than assumed. No soccer practice, no music lesson, no enrichment activity booked months in advance by a parent who had identified an area of developmental opportunity. The hours between 6 a.m. and noon on Saturday were the only hours in the week that belonged to you without a prior claim from any adult institution. The Saturday morning ritual, the color bars, the cereal, the cartoons, the neighborhood, was built in that gap, and it was built there because that was where the time was. You didn't have it on Monday. You didn't have it on Sunday, which was organized by different forces. Saturday morning was the exception, and the exception ran on its own rules. Noon approached the way a season approaches. You could feel it in the quality of the air before any clock confirmed it. CBS ran longest. Black Star at noon and the CBS Saturday Film Festival at 12:30 kept that network in children's territory past the boundary. ABC had the weekend special at noon, still produced for children, still technically Saturday morning programming, but at a different pace, slower, more deliberate. A live-action children's drama rather than animation. The energy in the living room shifted when it came on. The cartoon window was still technically open, but something had changed in the room, and you could feel the change before you could name it. At 1 p.m. on ABC, American Bandstand. Dick Clark, teenagers dancing to music aimed at an entirely different age demographic. Commercials for products nobody in your household was buying. American Bandstand had been running on ABC Saturday afternoons since 1957, a fixture of the Saturday schedule that predated the Saturday morning cartoon block by nearly a decade. A reminder that the television and the network had been there longer than you had and would continue long after Saturday morning's claim on the programming expired. The teenagers on the screen looked ancient from the carpet. The music was recognizably music, but aimed somewhere other than 8 a.m. Then ABC's Wide World of Sports, spanning the globe to bring you the constant variety of sport, the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. The opening reel with the ski jumper at Oberstdorf in 1970, Vinko Bogataj, a Slovenian athlete, losing his footing and cartwheel crashing off the end of the ramp, had been used in the program's introduction sequence so consistently that by the early 1980s, it had become one of the most widely recognized images in American sports broadcasting, repeated each week as a kind of ritual acknowledgement that failure was as much a part of the experience as success. Though the producers of a Saturday afternoon sports program probably didn't frame it in those terms. Wide World of Sports ran 90 minutes and featured 2 or 3 events per show: ski jumping, cliff diving, demolition derbies, competitive weightlifting, lumberjack competitions, international cycling, whatever occupied the broadest possible definition of sport in a given Saturday's production slate. The transition from cartoons to Wide World of Sports happened in 3 stages. The ABC Weekend Special at noon was tolerable, still children's programming, still in the genre, if not the format. American Bandstand at 1 p.m. was the warning, the first clear evidence that the adults were reasserting their claim on the living room. Wide World of Sports was the confirmation. The pace was entirely different from 5 hours of saturated animation. The colors were muted, the camera moved slowly. The voices were calm and analytical rather than urgent and enthusiastic. The commercials were for car insurance and network news programs and products aimed at adults who had apparently been waiting quietly in the kitchen all morning for exactly this moment. The cartoon world didn't end at noon. It dissolved, gradually, from noon to about 1:30 p.m., the transition washing across the programming schedule the way light changes in a room in the late afternoon. Not a switch being thrown, but an imperceptible shift that you register only after it's already happened. By 1:30 p.m. on a Saturday in 1983, if you were watching ABC, you were watching a demolition derby in slow motion, with analytical commentary from a voice that had no connection to anything that had been on screen since 8 a.m., and the living room had been returned to the general household without anyone issuing a formal announcement. You knew the morning was over without being told. The television told you. It had told you the morning was yours at 8 a.m., and now it was telling you that arrangement had concluded, and you understood the transaction as clearly as you'd understood the opening. The theme songs from the morning would surface later, not by choice. They weren't something you could decide to remember or decide to forget. They appeared weeks or months later, in the middle of unrelated situations, fully intact, lyric and melody together, called up by nothing in particular. The Spider-Man theme from 1967, the Smurfs' La La song, the He-Man fanfare, the Fat Albert opening, the Schoolhouse Rock segments. These weren't memorized, they were installed by repetition. The way anything that runs at the same time in the same place week after week eventually becomes part of the structure of the week, rather than content that requires retention. 30 years later, you still know every word to Conjunction Junction without having rehearsed it once since 1985. You know it because you were on the carpet every Saturday morning at 8:25 a.m. when it came on, and the information went in whether you wanted it to or not. The Saturday morning cartoon block ended the way most things that define a generation end, not with a single announcement, but with a slow replacement, a gradual substitution of one thing by something else that didn't feel like loss until it was complete. The Children's Television Act of 1990, passed October 18th of that year, required broadcast networks to air educational and informational programming for children as a condition of license renewal. The FCC formalized the 3-hour weekly minimum in 1996. Networks shifted their Saturday blocks toward E/I compliant content, programming that met the regulatory standard, which wasn't the same thing as cartoons funded by toy companies and cereal manufacturers in a commercial ecosystem built around children's Saturday morning viewing. The commercial entertainment feedback loop that had made Saturday morning specific, the G.I. Joe show and the G.I. Joe toy commercial on the same Saturday morning block, the cereal mascot as both advertising figure and cultural icon, the toy as both product and narrative universe, became legally and financially complicated at the scale that had sustained it. Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, operating on cable and therefore beyond FCC content regulations, provided animated programming around the clock. The scarcity that had made Saturday morning a ritual evaporated. In 2014, the CW became the last major broadcast network to discontinue a dedicated Saturday morning cartoon lineup, closing a chapter in American broadcasting that had been running since the late 1960s. The legislative history is interesting. What it points toward is more fundamental. You needed appointment television for the ritual to work. If you missed the 8 a.m. start of Super Friends was gone for 7 days. You can find that episode on a streaming service right now. But finding it tonight isn't the same thing as the knowledge at 6 a.m. that it was happening in 2 hours and you needed to be in front of the television or it would disappear. The scarcity created urgency. The urgency made the waiting real, which made the watching matter in a way that on-demand access structurally can't replicate. Streaming services offer infinite content and no ritual. The ritual required limits. You needed 3 channels essentially. Not 40, not a personalized recommendation feed. 3 choices, maybe 4. Every child in your school was watching roughly the same shows on the same Saturday morning, which meant that Monday was a shared debrief rather than a fragmented comparison of individualized viewing histories. There was a reasonable probability that the person you sat next to in 3rd grade had watched the Smurfs at 9 a.m. on NBC and the Scooby-Doo mask reveal at 11 a.m. on ABC and the same GI Joe commercial and the same Diggum Frog commercial, and had been watching it all with the same oversized cereal bowl on their lap. The common schedule was social infrastructure. It required scarcity to function. You needed the pre-parent window. That gap between 6 a.m. and whenever adults appeared in the kitchen was the only genuinely unscheduled time in a child's week. No enrichment, no lesson, no organized activity. The Saturday morning ritual was assembled in that gap not because anyone designed it there, but because that was where the time existed. Real autonomy was rare at 7 years old. Saturday morning was where you had it, chosen by you, timed by you, poured the way you wanted to pour it, watched from whatever position on the carpet you'd claimed before anyone else was awake. That specific quality of freedom doesn't have a current equivalent. It belonged to a structural condition. No smartphones, no parent-accessible location tracking, no obligation to be reachable, that no longer exists in American childhood. You can watch every episode of the Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner show tonight on a streaming platform. You can find the full 1982 ABC Saturday morning lineup, episode by episode. The Pac-Man cartoon and its inexplicable domestic setting, and its wife named Pepper, and its Pac-Land with its round, yellow inhabitants is all findable. But watching it on a laptop after dinner isn't the same thing, and everyone who is actually there knows that immediately and doesn't need it explained. The memory isn't of the cartoons. The memory is the container the cartoons lived inside. The SMPTE color bars at 6 a.m., the 15 kilohertz horizontal scanning frequency of the CRT tube warming up in the dark living room. Diggum Frog on the side of the yellow Honey Smacks box that you still called Sugar Smacks because the name change happened 2 years ago and the old name was the one that stuck. The handbrake on the big wheel pulled hard enough to initiate the sideways slide across the neighbor's driveway, the plastic rear wheels losing their grip on the concrete in exactly the way they were designed to lose it. Schoolhouse Rock arriving at 8:25 a.m. in the transition between two shows you were already watching. The ABC Wide World of Sports theme arriving at 1 p.m. like a time signal that something had concluded. These memories exist only in the bodies and minds of people who were there, born between roughly 1969 and 1982, in American households with access to one of 3 broadcast networks on a Saturday morning in the early 1980s. They can't be downloaded. They were made once, in specific rooms, on specific Saturdays in October and November and February and May, by children who were the first ones up and who knew without being told that the morning was theirs and that it had edges, and who sat inside those edges with a bowl of cereal that was too full and a television that had just warmed up and a Saturday that was just beginning. Simple times. Great TV, not by any critical standard, but great in the way things are great when they're yours and you're 7 and the cartoons don't start for 90 minutes and you're already on the carpet. Best music, best movies, no internet waiting to demand your attention every 11 seconds. Nobody had organized the morning in advance. Nobody needed to. We had it so good. You know that. You've known it for a long time. Subscribe for more stories like this.